Hey, what's going on, AP people? We have a very important video for you today covering Chapter 13 of Alan Brinkley's American History. We're basically covering about 20 years worth of material leading up to the Civil War. Before we get started, I want to let you know if you want to download the PowerPoint used in this video, please follow the link over to APUSHreview.com. You can download the PowerPoint for every other video I've done, and also take a look in the description for other videos that relate to this chapter. I go a lot more in depth in specific topics. So let's get going. All right, we're going to start off talking about something called Manifest Destiny. Here's a very famous painting you should be familiar with. We have an angel in the center of the painting, and everybody is moving to the left or the west. And this is the belief that it is the God-given right to expand from coast to coast. So the United States should expand all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. This was a term that was coined by newspaper writer John O'Sullivan. Be familiar with him as well. So who were some opponents to expansion during this time period? Well, you had some Whigs, and most notably Henry Clay. And anybody who really opposed the expansion of the United States at this time did so because there was this fear of increasing tensions over slavery. Once this land was added into the country, the question would be, would this land be slave or free? And some people realized that this could cause lots of tensions. Texas is declaring its independence in 1836, and for the next 9 years it will be its own independent country. At the Battle of San Jacinto, Santa Anna, the leader of Mexico, signs a treaty that recognizes the independence of Texas. He later goes back on that word, but he does it in 1836. Presidents Jackson and Martin Van Buren both hesitated to annex Texas, and the reason why was there was this fear of exacerbating or increasing sectional strife or sectional conflict. Again, it goes back to this word here, slavery. Okay, President Polk we're going to talk a little bit about, but before we do, let's talk about Oregon and this idea of a joint occupation with Britain. All the way up here from the 5440 latitude line down to the 42° north latitude line is jointly occupied by both Britain and the United States. When Polk was president, there was a slogan that developed, which was 5440 or fight, meaning that the U.S. wanted to claim all the way up to the 5440° latitude. In the end, the United States and Britain settle on the 49th parallel, which just continues the boundary that was already there. So Polk and the U.S. does not gain all the way up here, but they do settle pretty much in the middle of the 49th parallel. All right, so who's migrating west during this time? You have prosperous young people. And the reason why you're seeing prosperous and young people is you need to have money to go out west. And why are people moving west? The biggest factor is money, the search of money, and an opportunity to start a new life. Many people traveled on the Oregon Trail. If you've never played that computer game, it's probably like 25 years old at this point, but it's a great game. You get to like die from malaria on it. It's amazing. And Native Americans on the Oregon Trail played a huge role in guiding individuals. And most individuals did walk on that trail. So look at that 1,000+ mile journey that you'd have to walk. That's a long time through mountain ranges too. Okay, let's talk about the annexation of Texas. This was the key issue in the election of 1844. And Polk, who wins the election, he defeats Henry Clay, fully supports the annexation. Henry Clay kind of went back and forth on the issue of Texas. Texas is annexed via a joint resolution instead of a treaty, and what a joint resolution is that both houses of Congress have to approve. And in December of 1845, Texas is finally admitted into the Union as a slave state. And there's this boundary issue, however, though. Texas is going to claim the Rio Grande River, and Mexico is going to claim the Nueces River. And this is going to be this boundary issue that will essentially start the Mexican-American War. So all this area here in green is going to be this disputed territory. But what Texas is saying down here is the Rio Grande here, that's their southern border. And Mexico says, absolutely not. This Nueces River here, that is your southern border. So this land here is going to cause a dispute. And President Polk sought to buy California from Mexico, but they did in fact refuse. So the only way the U.S. could get this land was essentially by going to war. So let's talk about this guy down here, Santa Anna. He becomes leader of Mexico again during the Mexican-American War. And it really starts again with that boundary issue that I just talked about. These spot resolutions were introduced into Congress by a man by the name of Abraham Lincoln, who got the nickname of Spotty Lincoln because Americans are killed to start the Mexican-American War. Polk urges Congress to declare war. He said that American blood was spilled on American soil. The problem was that soil was in that disputed territory. So people like Lincoln were like, I don't know if that's really American territory. Give me the exact spot of the location. Then we have Henry David Thoreau, who writes a very famous writing called Civil Disobedience, in which he urged people to break laws that they felt were unjust, and he wrote this in response to the Mexican-American War. Nicholas Trist was sent by President Polk to negotiate the treaty with Mexico, which he ultimately does, and that treaty is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, in which the U.S. pays Mexico $15 million, and they gain the Mexican cession, which is a huge chunk of land, including California, they get. This leads to some sectional debate, however, and the Wilmot Proviso absolutely positively no David Wilmot, a Democrat from Pennsylvania, that should say, not New York. Sorry, Pennsylvania. He introduced an amendment to a bill stating that slavery would not exist in any land gained from Mexico. So he was against having slavery in the territories that were gained from Mexico. And again, this is just a perfect example of westward expansion in the issue of slavery. Now, this will pass the House because there's more population in the North that supports this, but it does not pass the Senate. The South will reject it in the Senate. A party that develops is the Free Soil Party, led by this guy, Salmon P. Chase from Cincinnati. He goes on to become Lincoln's Treasury Secretary and the 6th Chief Justice of the United States. The idea of the Free Soilers were they were against the extension of slavery into these new territories. And they had this slogan called Free Labor, Free Soil, and Free Men. In the late 1840s, we have the Gold Rush, which really started at John Sutter's Mills. And also you have a group of people known as the 49ers, the 1849 Gold Rush, and that's also why the San Francisco football team is named the 49ers. Now, most of these people who went west were men, although the population increased significantly in only 4 years, from 14,000 to 220,000. That's an enormous amount of influx in population in just 4 years. Okay, so the issue is going to be what will the fate of the newly acquired land be? Well, as long as they were territories, the federal government would decide the fate of slavery. And we have personal liberty laws that begin to pass in the North, which are laws that are passed by northern states that bar the involvement of northern states in returning runaway slaves. And this will be passed in response to the Compromise of 1850. There are 5 parts, and the architect of this is none other than Henry Clay here. At age 72, he was a senator and really helped settle this dispute, at least short term. So be familiar with all 5 parts, guys. And the first part is popular sovereignty in the Mexican cession. Again, the idea that people living in the territory could decide if they want to be free or slave. California is admitted as a free state, and this will now tip the balance in favor of free states in Congress. There is a more strict fugitive slave law, which again, in turn, leads to more personal liberty laws in the North. And the North is not going to support this fugitive slave law. The slave trade is outlawed in Washington, D.C. Not slavery, just the slave trade. And most of that was due to the fact that there are a lot of foreign dignitaries who were in Washington, D.C., and many people did not want the dignitaries to see the horrific slave trade occurring. And also, Texas is claiming some land that the federal government says does not belong to them. So Texas is given money to pay off some of their debt to relinquish some of their land. And I do have an entire video on the Compromise of 1850, so do check that out as well. So what is notable about the Compromise of 1850? Well, it's the end of the Great Triumvirate, which consists of Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and Daniel Webster. Also, this is not in your book, but be familiar with Daniel Webster's 7th of March speech, and he gives this, believe it or not, on March 7th. And he urged Congress, and really the North, to support the Fugitive Slave Act to avoid conflict. So he said there are some people in the North who have to give in and should support the Fugitive Slave Act for the good of the country. And he really takes a lot of heat for this from Northern abolitionists. Also, we have the emergence of Stephen Douglas as a national leader. He plays a key role with Henry Clay in the passage of it. Okay, let's talk about the crises of the 1850s. Lots going on. Again, the North opposes the Fugitive Slave Act, which leads to personal liberty laws, which leads to tensions between the North and the South. This is essentially nullification, and the South is not going to like it. Franklin Pierce becomes president. There was a time period known as Young America, and Franklin Pierce believed in the expansion of U.S. democracy, not just in the United States, but elsewhere as well. The Ostend Manifesto would have happened during his time period, but it did not occur. But this was a plan to buy Cuba from Spain, and if they refused, the U.S. would take it by force. And the whole purpose of this was that Cuba would be made a slave state. And some Northerners found out about this, and they blocked the passage of the Ostend Manifesto. The Gadsden Purchase also happens during his time, which is this little yellow area of land here. Now the continental expansion of the United States, the present-day boundaries, are settled with the Gadsden Purchase. And the reason the Gadsden Purchase was purchased was because of a railroad. They wanted to build a transcontinental railroad. I urge you, if you have not already, check out Jimmy Fallon's Gadsden Purchase video. It is hysterical and incredibly factually accurate. And this was purchased in part due to the Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, who goes on to be the Confederate States of America president. All right, let's talk about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. We have Stephen Douglas. He is back. He's the architect of this. This is a response to the Gadsden Purchase because the North wanted their own railroad. So Stephen Douglas proposed this act, and this act would propose popular sovereignty in the Nebraska Territory. This is a problem for many in the North because it's overturned the Missouri Compromise. Both Kansas and Nebraska are above that magical 3630 line. Presumably, Kansas would become slave and Nebraska would be free. That was kind of the unwritten rule of it, but it does not work out that way at all. We have something called Bleeding Kansas, which is a series of events in which pro and anti-slavery people show up in large numbers to vote. Now, keep in mind, this idea of popular sovereignty is only people living in that territory should vote. So before Kansas and Nebraska could vote on the issue of them being a free or slave state, many people living outside those territories moved in to vote. We have a free soil town of Lawrence, Kansas, which is burned to the ground. A couple days later, we have the caning of Charles Sumner, in which Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts is beaten at his desk by a member of the House of Representatives from South Carolina. A few days after that, we have Pottawatomie Creek Massacre, led by John Brown, which was a response to the burning of Lawrence, Kansas, and the caning as well. So lots of chaos happening in Kansas. Again, let's talk about some free soilers. They were anti-slavery in the extension of slavery, but they certainly wanted to keep it from expanding. And the reason they felt this way was that they believed that slavery took away jobs from whites. And this helps morph into the newly formed Republican Party in the mid-1850s. The North believed that there was a slave power conspiracy occurring, which meant that the South sought to expand slavery, and this must be destroyed. They thought it was this very evil thing that was taking over the government. And some pro-slavery arguments from the South were caused in large part by different rebellions and important writings, including Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. John C. Calhoun claimed that it was a positive good, both for slave owners and slaves. He said that slaves were well taken care of, and they were better off than many workers in the North. There was religious justification, since slavery is in the Bible, and probably the biggest reason is racial superiority, this belief that many whites felt they were superior to African Americans. All right, President Buchanan is elected in 1856, and he's elected because he is Kansas-less, meaning he was not associated with the Kansas-Nebraska Act whatsoever. In 1857, just after he's inaugurated, we have the Panic of 1857, which is caused by over-speculation. And the South is really, the cotton industry in the South is really not hit hard at all. And this kind of gives the South this false hope that they can survive anything. Within a couple days of Buchanan being inaugurated, we have probably the worst court case in United States history, Dred Scott versus Sanford, which occurs in 1857. And Dred Scott was a slave that lived in Illinois and Wisconsin, and he sued for his freedom, saying that he lived in a free state and a free territory. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says the following. 1. Dred Scott, sorry, you cannot sue because you are not a citizen. So instantly, every African American living in the country is not a citizen, whether they are free or slave. The court went even further to say that slaves were a property and they could not be taken away without due process, which is promised in the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution. And furthermore, Congress could not eliminate slavery in the territory, so that further overturned the Missouri Compromise of 1820. This is a huge disaster, and it angers many, many people in the North. Lots of slave owners in the South will rejoice at this as it supports their cause. All right, let's talk about President Lincoln. But before he becomes President Lincoln, in 1858, he runs for the Senate seat of Illinois. And he challenges Stephen Douglas, who is the incumbent senator, to a series of debates known as the Lincoln-Douglas debates. This textbook does not go in depth with this topic at all. I do have a video on this, so I encourage you to watch that as well. There is a series of 7 debates for the Senate seat in Illinois, and Stephen Douglas wins, but he alienates the South in the process, and he does so by his Freeport Doctrine. If you want to know what the Freeport Doctrine is, check out my video on the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Very important, and that pretty much guarantees Abe Lincoln will become president in 1860. So Lincoln also emerges on a national level during this time period. In 1859, we have John Brown from Kansas. He causes all sorts of ruckus in Virginia, or present-day West Virginia, at Harper's Ferry. And he hoped to incite a slave rebellion, so he takes over this large arsenal, and he hopes that many slaves will come running to this arsenal, get guns, and start this massive slave rebellion. It does not work out that way at all. However, many Southerners felt that the North and the Republican Party was filled with people like John Brown. And this really is not true whatsoever. The Republican Party did not associate themselves with John Brown. They tried to distance themselves from John Brown. Abe Lincoln did as well. John Brown was a radical for his time that did not have popular support. In the election of 1860, Lincoln wins the election without receiving a single electoral vote from the South, which will cause South Carolina and several other states afterwards to secede from the Union. They felt that if the president could win without a single Southern vote, that their voice was not being heard. And again, secession begins. Okay, 2 things that are not in this book, but you should be familiar with. A very famous book during this time was called The Impending Crisis of the South, written by Hinton Helper. And this book argued that the non-slave owning whites were hurt the most in the South. So this was anti-slavery, but for different reasons, because it hurt those 3/4 of white Americans living in the South that did not own slaves. And you might hear this term fire eaters, and these are Southerners that threatened secession during this time period. All right, that's everything you need to know about Chapter 13 of Alan Brinkley's American History. I hope this video helped. If you want to know, Santa Anna, he lost his leg in a battle with the French. And then something happens to his wooden leg during the Mexican-American War. It's pretty interesting. If you want to know more about that, I encourage you to check out the video I did on the Mexican-American War. Thank you very much for watching. If you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the section below, and have a good day.